In this lecture, we're going to talk about retirement from sport or transitions out of sport. We'll talk about why athletes retire or transition away from sport, about some of the psychological challenges that presents, and some of the things that help athletes more successfully make that challenging adjustment. We know that sooner or later, almost every athlete is going to retire from their competitive sport, at least from the level at which they're accustomed to performing, whether that be competitive youth, college, Olympic, professional, whatever level that may be. For many athletes, retirement is a significant psychological event. It's one of the bigger challenges they face in their lifetimes, and it's a challenge for adjustment and coping. In fact, it is such a big challenge, such a major life adjustment, that some researchers even compare retirement to being similar to a significant loss or even a death, like the death of a loved one. And they use coping models about how people cope with death to try to understand how people adjust to this new phase of life of retirement from their sport. And in some ways, retirement is a loss. It is a loss of self. It's a loss of one of ourselves. One of the ways we think about ourselves, if you are an Olympic or professional athlete and you're no longer going to pursue that or engage that activity, that is a loss of a self. And so it makes some sense why they do look at it as a significant loss experience. As a result of this, many athletes do experience a kind of grieving process, and that's a natural part of the process for many athletes who retire, but not everyone. Some feel relief, some feel freedom, some feel a sense of relaxation and release upon retirement. But for many folks, it is a significant challenge and a process that leads to some level of grieving. Now, there's a lot of different things go into when we talk about retirement. One thing we can say for sure is that no two retirements are quite the same. There are so many variables that go into this experience that it's hard to even compare from one athlete to the next what their experience will be like or what they should experience or how they should cope with it. Some of the many variables on which retirements can vary include things like timing. Retirements can be early. Say, before somebody has reached their peak or their prime. Many of us in Oklahoma can recall the career of Barry Sanders, perhaps the best athlete ever at Oklahoma State University and one of the best, if not the best, running backs in the history of the game of football, who many were perplexed that they thought he retired in the middle of his prime. He quit playing professional football, what many people thought before he should have. So that was an example of an early retirement, perhaps. Some people retire late, long after most everybody else knew that they probably should have retired or left the scene. They kept hanging on and hanging in there, and there's psychological aspects to that. Or we can think of what we call on-time retirements, which are kind of predictable. Everybody assumes, everybody's kind of on the same page that this is the right time for this person to retire. Retirements can be, and ideally would be, voluntary, that people make a free choice, that now is the time for me to make this change in my life. But sometimes they're involuntary, and we'll talk in the next slide about some of the many reasons why involuntary retirements might happen. Retirements can be sudden, especially those that are created by a sudden injury that perhaps ends a career. They can sort of come out of the blue, out of nowhere, that retirement is required or necessary for some reason right now. Or retirements can be coming for years, and people can be planning for them and expecting them and sort of taking steps in that direction. Retirements can happen for some folks when they are very, very young, or for some folks when they're quite a bit older. It depends a lot on the sport in which they play. For example, in gymnastics, particularly women's gymnastics, it's not unusual to see people retire from the highest levels of competition before even college age, before even becoming young adults. They may retire from that sport. In other sports, golf is an example. People may be able to compete at that at a very high level, even professionally, well into their 50s or even 60s. And so there can be a wide variety of the age at which somebody retires, and that can have an impact on the adjustment, the challenge that is created by retirement. Retirements can, of course, be caused by many circumstances. Probably the most common and the one that pops obviously immediately to mind is simply the natural aging process and the diminished skills that come along with that. It's simply not possible to prevent individuals from losing speed, quickness, power, as one ages, and sooner or later that catches up with folks. Individuals may experience retirements because of free choice. They're simply done with their career. They may lose interest or the passion for their sport. They may lose the interest in maintaining the level of commitment that it takes to succeed in their sport. Or they may have other goals or priorities. You'll hear people talk about they want to spend more time with family, or they want to work on business interests, or they want to pursue education. So there may just simply be other goals or priorities. Sometimes, sadly, people are involuntarily moved towards retirement simply by deselection. They're unable to continue performing at that level. So, for example, a intercollegiate student athlete who exhausts their eligibility and is no longer able to perform and is not doesn't have the capability to perform at a professional level. Perhaps a professional who can't find a team to sign them, or somebody who will continue employing them to pursue that sport. So deselection is a risk. Olympic athletes who are no longer selected for the national team might be another example. Certainly injury is a possibility, especially those that don't have complete rehabilitation or lead to some sort of disability. We can think of examples of athletes in history who were at their prime, at the peak of their sport, and then experienced some injury. Maybe they tore an Achilles tendon or had a major knee injury or something like that, and they just couldn't quite recover and ever be themselves again, and ultimately had to retire because of diminished abilities related to that injury and incomplete rehabilitation. Sometimes people retire because the sport no longer wants them there. There may be disciplinary issues. There may be rule violations where they are banned from the sport for things like violations of substance use policies or gambling on the sport or those sorts of things, where individuals may simply be shunned from their sport, from being a participant into the future. And lastly, people can sometimes have interfering life circumstances. They may have health issues. We've known athletes who've had to retire because they developed cancer or some other health issue. Some may have mental health struggles that make it impossible for them to continue. And substance use is unfortunately a fairly common issue as well that derails somebody's career, not just in sport, but in lots of careers, by the way. But we certainly see it happen in sport. So there's all kinds of different ways, reasons, timing, situations in which people can move into the retirement phase of their life. And this can create a significant adjustment challenge. Now, I don't want to overstate this. For the vast majority of athletes, their transition into retirement is relatively smooth, especially for those who have on-time, voluntary retirements that they've seen coming, they've prepared for. That's sort of the ideal model for a retirement, and those are typically done pretty smoothly. There may be a temporary grieving process, but they're able to cope with it fairly well, and within a very short period of time, move on with their lives and be productive in other areas. For other folks, retirement can present a very significant adjustment challenges, and there's a lot of reasons for that. There's a lot of things that create this challenge. For example, there can be a loss of identity. Who am I if I'm not an Olympic athlete, a tennis player, a professional athlete? Who am I if I'm not on a team, if I'm not a team captain? What does that mean about who I am? People may lose social connections. For many people in sport, their lives are built around their sport participation. Most of their friends are teammates and other people involved in the sport. And if they retire and they don't have the chance to be around them at training, traveling, in competitions, what does that mean for their social connection, their social network? Who are my friends? Where's my support? Many athletes experience a loss of routines. High-level, elite-level athletes are creatures of routine. They almost everything they do every moment of every day goes into preparation for their sport. What they choose off menus at restaurants, what they choose to eat, how they schedule their day, how they spend their time, the daily training that goes into their sport. That all is gone when retirement comes, and that change in routine is upsetting. That's one of the main things we know is psychological challenging for folks in lots of contexts. So when you just change your routine, that's a stressor and creates a challenge for coping and adjustment. And for some athletes, the loss of their sport is a loss of an important outlet for expressing themselves, for expressing their emotions, or maybe expressing and getting out their aggression. And they have to find other ways to cope with that or express that in healthy ways during the adjustment to retirement as well. Because of these challenges, there can be a lot of psychological experiences that come along with this transition. Many athletes report experiencing some confusion, not sure who they are, what the future holds, what to do today, or what to do tomorrow, and that can be challenging. Many experience loneliness or isolation as a result of the fairly dramatic changes in social connections and support networks. And many experience or report experiencing a sense of, at least temporarily, of a sense of emptiness, a lack of purpose. What am I here for? What am I trying to accomplish? What are my goals right now? Remember, especially elite athletes are incredibly goal-oriented people, and when that goal is sort of suddenly no longer relevant, it's a challenge to figure out what's important to me now. We know that, as I mentioned, many athletes experience this transition quite smoothly, and there's a lot of protective factors that go into that. So if we think about what makes it easier for athletes to make this transition, there's a lot of things we could put in place. One thing that we know helps is for athletes who have multiple identities and multiple selves. They think of themselves not just as a competitor or an athlete in their particular sport, but they also perhaps think of themselves as a parent or a family member. They may think of themselves as a business person, as a leader, perhaps as a coach, perhaps as a celebrity of some kind. They have other kinds of selves or identities that they can turn to and invest in because that one identity is no longer present. We also know that athletes who have multiple interests find it easier. So athletes who are interested in more things than just their sport, whether that be family, business, career, coaching, education, philanthropy, volunteering. The more broader interests that an athlete has, the easier it is when they lose one part of their interests and move on to other parts of their life to invest their energies in other important things. We know that athletes who cope with retirement better tend to have done some prior work. They've prepared for that. They've done what we call exploratory behavior early on, perhaps years before they actually reach the retirement decision. They've begun trying to think about, figure out, explore, talk to, pursue education to prepare them for other interests when the time comes. Athletes who've done none of that prior exploratory behavior, the retirement transition is much harder because they've got a lot of ground to make up to try to be able to cope with that moving forward. Another protective factor is athletes who have developed and identify within themselves transferable skills. You know, there's a lot of life skills that athletes develop in preparation for their sport: commitment, leadership, goal orientation, those sorts of things that transfer really easily to other areas of life. And so the athletes who identify that, know about that, are going to be better off. Also, we know athletes transition more smoothly if they have fairly diverse support networks. What we mean by that is that they have friends, supporters, family members that they're close with that are outside of the circle of just their sport participation. It's not just their teammates, their coaches, their sponsors, their agents, those sorts of things, but they have other kinds of folks who are in their lives who are outside of that arena who can then help them transition into other dimensions. And lastly, we know an important protective factor is athletes having resources available to help them do things like pursue exploratory behaviors, plan, build diverse support networks. The picture on the slide here is an example of a university that has a life skills center for athletes that a major part of their focus is developing the athletes' identities, their selves, their skills, and their preparation so that when their college sport experience is over, and for many of them that will mean the end or retirement from their competitive sport, that they will be prepared to move on to other aspects of their life. So in sum, a few takeaway points. We know that retirement is inevitable for virtually all athletes, depending on the sport. It comes at different ages, different times, and can come about from many different ways. Retirement transitions can sometimes be problematic in terms of their adjustment, although many athletes cope with it quite well. For some athletes, it can be a very difficult adjustment to make, and perhaps one of the more difficult things they've done in their lives. We know there's a bunch of variables that do predict smoother transitions, and there are a number of those things that can be implemented and put in place for athletes within their context to help them in advance of the retirement and transition to be more successful, to cope better, and to move smoothly into retirement at the end of their competitive participation.